Welcome to week 1 of Existentialism. My aim in these videos is to provide a brief overview of the reading each week. So the first piece I've asked you to read by Kierkegaard is called Stages on Life's Way. Here, on page 182, Kierkegaard distinguishes what he calls 3 existence spheres: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. Now these 3 sorts of life, 3 ways of living, or 3 registers of value, are going to organize our readings for the next couple of weeks. So today, we're looking at either or. Here, Kierkegaard tries to portray the aesthetic life and to show why the aesthetic life is ultimately unsatisfactory. And he wants to do so in such a way that provides an internal critique of the aesthetic life. So he's not going to appeal to any ideals or values other than the ones that the aesthetic life itself puts forward. What Kierkegaard wants to show is that the aesthetic life fails by its own standard, and it does so in such a way that suggests to us that the ethical life is a better way of living. So the ethical life is going to do a better job than the aesthetic life of achieving the aesthetic life's own aims. And so for next week, we're going to look at fear and trembling. And there, the same thing is going to happen with the ethical life and the religious life. Kierkegaard is going to try to show us that there's a problem in the ethical life that the ethical life cannot itself solve, but that the religious life can. Okay, but what are these lives? I said that you could think of them as different registers of value. So the thought here is that in the aesthetic life, things show up as good to us insofar as they're pleasurable, and things appear bad insofar as they're displeasurable. So things are either tasty or insipid, interesting or boring. In the ethical life, by contrast, the good things are morally right or just, while the bad things are morally wrong or unjust. And in the religious life, which is the kind of life that Kierkegaard is going to suggest is the best way of living, the good is the subjective or the absurd, while the bad is the objective or the rational. So just to give you an example, if you're living an aesthetic life, a particular coffee might show up as good to you insofar as it's hot, or a coffee might present itself as good to you insofar as it's bitter or chocolatey. If you're living the ethical life, the same things show up in your world, but they show up in different terms or under a different valence. Here, a particular coffee will present itself as good, as to be drunk, insofar as it's fairly traded. Okay, so let's turn now to either or, where Kierkegaard attempts to portray the aesthetic life from its own point of view and to show how it ultimately faces a problem that it can't itself solve and that it's better solved in the ethical life. So on page 55, Kierkegaard considers that if boredom is what's bad or evil, how do we overcome it? Kierkegaard suggests that everyone who's bored calls out for change, but then he goes on to distinguish 2 sorts of change, one of which he thinks is much more satisfying than the other. So the first unsatisfying sort of change he calls an extensive change. He writes, "One is weary of living in the country and moves to the city. One is weary of one's native land and goes abroad. One is weary of Europe and goes to America," etc. He writes, "One indulges in the fanatical hope of an endless journey from star to star." Now, Kierkegaard says that this method cancels itself and is the spurious infinity. All right, so I want you to think about what's ultimately unsatisfying or boring, remember, because that's what's bad from the point of view of the aesthetic, about this sort of change. And what's the alternative? Kierkegaard offers a few examples on 56 and 57, and he finally gives us the answer on 60. There, he says that the secret is that one must continually vary oneself. He says it's essential to have control over one's moods. So it seems that the 2 kinds of change Kierkegaard's trying to distinguish here is, on the one hand, a change in the objects of one's interest, and on the other hand, a change in the subject who takes an interest in things. Now, the question that this obviously invites for the person living an aesthetic life is, how do you vary yourself? How do you take control of your own subjectivity and vary your moods. Now, Kierkegaard's answer to this question is the ethical life. Right? So it's meant to be the ethical life that allows one to change one's own subjectivity. And so in this way, the ethical life will provide the answer to a question that came up in the aesthetic life, but couldn't be answered in the aesthetic life itself. So Kierkegaard characterizes the ethical life in this way on page 73 up to page 77. He begins by saying that if your choice is an aesthetic choice, it's really no choice at all. And to explain why not, he says that an aesthetic choice is either altogether immediate or itself is lost in a great multiplicity. So that's the first thing to think about here. In what sense are aesthetic choices immediate? In what sense are they lost in a multiplicity? And what's the contrast? Kierkegaard says that an ethical choice is self-determining. He says that through an ethical choice, one's personality is consolidated. And on 77, he draws the contrast in these terms. He says, the aesthetic in a person is that by which he spontaneously and immediately is what he is. The ethical is that by which he becomes what he becomes. So for Kierkegaard, when you're living an aesthetic life, you just are. And by contrast, when you're living an ethical life, you're becoming. And you're becoming in such a way that it's you who's determining who you're becoming. And so I think this suggests to us why in the ethical life, or how in the ethical life, you're able to vary yourself. If in the ethical life you are becoming who you are, and you have some power to determine who it is you become, it's through ethical choice making that you can take control over who you are. Okay, so that's an outline of Kierkegaard's argument that the ethical life is more satisfactory than the aesthetic life. What I want you to do in your papers this week is try to work through that argument in a bit more detail. Think about why aesthetic choices are unsatisfactory from their own point of view, and why it is that ethical choices are more satisfactory just from the point of view of the aesthetic life. So in your paper, you're really meant to argue for two theses. The first one is a more interpretive thesis, and the second one is a thesis of your own, evaluating Kierkegaard's view on your interpretation. So first, try to explain to me what the argument is for the superiority of the ethical life over the aesthetic life. And then, evaluate that argument. Tell me to what extent you think it's successful or unsuccessful. Try to identify the weak points in the argument and assess whether they undermine the argument or not. And so the thesis of your own that you're going to defend is going to be about the satisfactoriness of Kierkegaard's own argument.